Welcome to the channel. Today's story is from 1968. Several similar tragedies occurred that year. 1968 became the year when humanity for the first time looked too deeply into the abyss. That year more than 200 sailors died, and not one of the submarines sent a distress signal. Not a single request for help. As if they were simply erased from the world. The sea breathes slowly. It does not rush, does not apologize, does not explain. For it there is neither time nor guilt. There is only depth, a place where all living things sooner or later become silence. In January 1968, a submarine departed from English Portsmouth. An old hull, repainted in new colors, with a new flag and a new mission. On board, 69 people. Israelis. Young, confident, joyful. They called their ship INS Dakar, Victory. They were to cross the Mediterranean Sea and reach the port of Haifa. Just a few weeks' journey. But this journey became the last. But the history of this submarine began much earlier. Once, during World War II, the submarine bore another name, HMS Totem. It was built by the British when the Atlantic was still boiling with battles. It survived where hundreds of others sank. It saw destruction, knew fear. When the war ended, it was decommissioned, repaired, and in 1965 sold to Israel, a young country that needed its own defenders and its own shadows underwater. Then Totem became Dakar. The old ship received a new soul. And the sea, a new voice, which it would soon engulf. The commander of the Dakar was Major Yoram Ranon, a man with a straight posture, steel eyes, and that rare calmness that only those who have long gazed into the darkness of the depths possess. His crew trusted him completely. They joked in the mess hall, wrote letters home, took pictures on deck. They did not know that these photos would be their last. On January 9, 1968, the Dakar departed Portsmouth. It proceeded along the route through Gibraltar, past Crete, to the shores of Cyprus. On board, everything was going according to plan, no malfunctions, no alarm. Ranon even requested permission to arrive in Haifa 3 days ahead of schedule. The submarine was moving faster than expected. Headquarters agreed. And no one suspected that there was no way back. It was January 25. At midnight, the Dakar was located not far from Crete. The weather worsened, a storm rose over the sea. Waves crashed against the steel hull, the sea roared, but the submarine held on. A short message went out over the air, Dakar at depth, all in order. These were the last words. The radio stations heard nothing more. On the frequencies, silence. At first no one believed in disaster. Radio communication often disappeared in bad weather. But a day passed. Then another. On the third, headquarters began to worry. On the fourth, it became clear, the submarine had vanished. Searches began. Israel, Britain, USA, Greece, Turkey, and even Lebanon, all dispatched ships into the Mediterranean Sea. They scoured the waves, deployed sonars, dropped buoys. But the sea responded only with a hum. No distress signal, no oil slicks, no debris. As if the boat evaporated, dissolved in the salty abyss. A few days later, only one thing was found, an emergency buoy. It surfaced off the coast of Cyprus. On it, traces of an activated emergency beacon. But the hull of the Dakar was never found. Searches lasted weeks. Then, months. Then, they were stopped. 69 people became names on the list of the missing. Families waited, wrote letters, asked, hoped. Some said, "He will return," just delayed by the storm. But the sea does not return those it has decided to keep for itself. Since that day 32 years passed. In the spring of 2000, an American research vessel accidentally detected a strange object on the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. Depth, almost 3 kilometers. Between Crete and Cyprus. When underwater cameras descended, the spotlight illuminated a metallic silhouette. On board, the letters were still visible, DAKAR. She lay, as if sleeping. The hull was broken, but the conning tower was intact. Everything inside, as if time had stopped. No traces of explosion, no fire, no collision. Simply, heart failure. The heart of the boat. The cause of the sinking was never established. The sea is not in a hurry to explain. It only keeps. And if sometimes it returns something, it is only to remind, nothing disappears without a trace. Everything simply goes where words are no longer needed. There are many versions of what happened. Some say, a malfunction. Others, that the Dakar collided with a Soviet submarine. There are even those who are sure, it was sunk intentionally, due to secret missions or old military scores. But there is no proof. Only guesses, and an empty spot on the map between Crete and Cyprus, where the depth is 10,000 feet. And every time ships pass over this point, the sonar picks up a quiet, barely distinguishable echo, as if a breath underwater. Some sailors claim to have heard a faint metallic knock, as if someone is still waiting. Dakar became the first shadow of 1968. But not the last. The sea, as if, decided that it was not enough for it. Within a few weeks it took 3 more, French, Americans, and Russians. And in each case everything repeated, suddenness, silence, disappearance without a trace. They say the sea doesn't like witnesses. It takes exactly as much as it deems necessary. And every time the waves crash against the shore, someone somewhere hears a call, the call of those who did not return. Every sea has its own voice. The Mediterranean whispers. It doesn't shout, doesn't threaten, it merely calls. First quietly, barely noticeably, then more and more insistently. And if you listen too closely, you might not return. France, January 1968. At the Toulon Naval Base, a piercing frosty wind blew. The port smelled of salt, diesel, and iron. Sailors hurried along the pier, where the newest Daphne-class submarine stood, miniature, fast, almost silent. Its name, Minerve. In honor of the ancient Roman goddess of wisdom. Irony of fate, wisdom, the last thing one can find in the depths. The commander Lieutenant André Fauve was young, but already considered one of the best in his fleet. He trusted the boat. Minerve was experimental, small, yet technologically perfect. A new type of sonar, an improved surfacing system, a durable hull. It could hide where others had already lost contact with the surface. Fauve was proud of this ship. All that remained was to conduct short exercises and return to base. Just a few hours underwater. Just a few miles from the shore. Just one storm. January 27, 1968, 7:55 a.m. The sea began to change. Wind gusts intensified. A south wind drove the wave crests, on the surface, foam and a roar. Fauve ordered to surface to periscope depth and transmit a message, proceeding to shore. Returning to Toulon. End of communication. The radio operator acknowledged confirmation. This was the last contact. Within minutes, Minerve vanished from radar screens. No distress signal. No SOS. No cry on the airwaves. Only the roar of the wind over the waves. The French fleet was put on alert. Dozens of ships, planes, helicopters went out to search. On shore, families gathered, wives, mothers, children. That day, the sky over Toulon was gray, heavy, as if the sea and sky had conspired to hide everything that had happened. One of the pilots involved in the search would later say, "We flew square after square, but the sea was empty. No oil slick, no debris, not even a bubble of air." The fleet did not give up. The first day, the second, the third, the search continued. The storm subsided, the sun returned, but the sea remained silent. Then Admiral François Roland uttered a phrase that was recorded in the operations log: the sea decided not to share its secrets. Thus, Minerve became the second shadow. Its disappearance shook France. Newspapers wrote about the unexplained tragedy. Journalists searched for any hint, an air leak, an engine malfunction, human error. But these were all just conjectures. There were no real traces. Years passed. The sight of Minerve's demise became a legend among sailors. Some whispered that it went to the bottom after colliding with a merchant vessel. Others, that it exploded from within, due to a faulty valve. And some said, that it simply disappeared into the fog, into that very gray shroud where the horizon loses its shape and reality dissolves. When a ship disappears without a trace, sailors say, the sea took what was its. And when a submarine disappears, they say, it simply returned home. 50 years passed. It was already 2019. France had almost forgotten Minerve. But one woman did not forget, Hervé Fauve, the sister of Commander André. She spent her entire life seeking the resumption of the search. She said that the sea could not keep them forever. And one day, she was heard. Using the latest deep-sea technologies, a research vessel once again surveyed the seabed off the coast of Toulon. A few days later, a signal. A metallic silhouette, lying at a depth of 2,370 meters. The hull was bent, the bow pressed into the silt, but the inscription was still visible on the side, Minerve. France froze. After half a century of silence, the sea finally returned a name. But, not an answer. The technical commission concluded, most likely, a malfunction of the ballast system. The boat lost control and plunged to the depths faster than the crew could react. Instantly. Without pain. Without a scream. Only cold, pressure, and silence. Sometimes the sea doesn't kill. It just calls to itself. They say, when the operator first saw the hull of Minerve through the camera, he fell silent. Then he said softly, "She doesn't look dead. She looks like she's waiting." 52 names are engraved on the memorial in Toulon. Young, smiling faces. Their photographs still lie at the foot of the monument. Nearby, the words, ils n'y sont pas morts, ils reposent dans la mer. They did not die, they rest in the sea. 1968 continued on its course. At a time when France was mourning Minerve, another tragedy was already brewing somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. The sea was preparing its next victim. Sometimes it seems as if the oceans are a living creature. It breathes, observes, and chooses. And that year, it chose 4. There are sounds that can only be heard underwater. To where light doesn't reach, where pressure compresses air, where even metal groans from the depth. There, amidst the gloom and silence, sometimes one can hear a cry, not human, not animal, but the very pain of the ocean. In May 1968, the Atlantic cried out. And the world hasn't forgotten that sound. USA. Base in Norfolk, Virginia. At the pier stands a dark gray silhouette, the nuclear submarine USS Scorpion. On her hull, the number SSN 589. One of the newest ships in the American fleet. Fast, dangerous, almost invulnerable. Outside, the pride of the Navy. Inside, weariness. Mechanics knew, the submarine needed repairs. One of the torpedo compartments was malfunctioning, and the reactor required seal replacement. But the command was in a hurry. The Cold War wouldn't wait. Commander Francis Slattery, an officer with 20 years of experience. Reserved, weary, but dedicated to his duty. He had repeatedly written reports about malfunctions. But each time he received the same answer, later. Now we need to go to sea. On February 15, 1968, the Scorpion departed Norfolk, heading towards the shores of Europe. The mission, surveillance of Soviet vessels in the Mediterranean Sea. The mission was secret, like all missions of that time. 3 months underwater. 3 months of anxious reports, short radio messages, and echoing, metallic days. By May, the submarine was returning home. The crew dreamed of seeing their families, the sun, the shore. They were crossing the Atlantic. Home was already near. May 21, 1968, 7:54 a.m. The Scorpion made contact with the base. Closing in. Observing Soviet ships near the Azores. After that, silence. Days passed. May 22, no messages. May 23, nothing. When the ship didn't arrive in Norfolk at the scheduled time, wives and children gathered at the pier. Someone held a flag, someone flowers. The wind blew from the sea, smelling of salt and anxiety. But the ocean was silent. The American command declared an alert. 57 ships, planes, underwater probes, everything was thrown into the Atlantic. They scoured the ocean in the area between the Azores and the Canaries. Weeks of searching. Not a single trace. One of the sonar operators recalled, "We heard a strange sound. Like a loud bang, then a hum, and silence. It came from the deep. We didn't know then that it was the moment of the Scorpion's death." Later, the Americans established the location. Depth, almost 3 kilometers. There, in absolute darkness, lay the Scorpion. The hull broken into 2 parts. The bow section, as if exploded from within. Torpedo tubes damaged. The stern, relatively intact. But no people, none. All 99 crew members, disappeared. They vanished. The investigation lasted years. There were many theories. Some claimed that an explosion of its own warhead occurred in the torpedo compartment. Others, that the submarine became a victim of a Soviet attack. Some even spoke of a mutual duel, where the Scorpion managed to launch a torpedo, and the retaliatory strike came instantly. But there was no proof. Only sonar recordings, a series of muffled impacts, then, a rupture and silence. The Americans called this an acoustic event. Thus, technically, dryly, and impersonally, they designated the death of 99 people. Sometimes it seems that silence is the only language the sea speaks. We just don't know how to translate it. There's another story. A secret one, half whispered in old archives. In February of the same year, 3 months before the loss of the Scorpion, a Soviet submarine K-129 disappeared in the Pacific Ocean. She carried nuclear missiles on board. The Soviets searched for her unsuccessfully. The Americans knew another nuclear vessel was lost underwater. And then, a few weeks later, the Scorpion is lost. 2 similar dates. Too strange a coincidence. Some U.S. Navy officers whispered, perhaps it was a response. A secret blow for a blow. Perhaps it was a war we never learned about. The truth remained underwater. Documents classified, reports cut short. The officers' families never received explanations. Only dry phrases, the ship was lost in the line of duty. On the memorial in Norfolk, 99 names are engraved. And every year, on May 22, wreaths are laid on the water. The sea accepts them silently. Waves cover the flowers, and they descend, to where the Scorpion lies. The Scorpion, the third shadow. The third for that year. Israeli, Dakar, in January. French, Minerva, also in January. Now the American one, in May. And ahead, the fourth. The one with which everything, perhaps, began. In that same year, 1968, 2 months before the loss of the Scorpion, the Soviet Union lost a nuclear submarine with ballistic missiles. It was simply called K-129. It went into the northern waters of the Pacific Ocean. And never returned. In the depths of the Pacific Ocean there is a place where even time flows differently. There, under eternal darkness and cold, lies a ship that never returned home. Its name was K-129. But for the sea, names don't matter. It only remembers sounds, and the silence after them. February 1968. Kamchatka, Krasheninnikova Bay. A gray morning, snowy haze, and against the backdrop of snow-covered hills, the silhouette of a submarine. The diesel engine's exhaust pipe quietly smokes. This is K-129, the pride of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. A new generation ship, a Project 629, a diesel-electric submarine, armed with 3 R-21 nuclear missiles, each with a warhead carrying a 1 megaton charge. Commander, Captain First Rank Vladimir Kobzar. A 40-year-old man, experienced, taciturn, one of those who speaks little, but every word weighs like lead. Crew, 83 people. On board, warheads, secret documents, orders, and a short, almost routine directive, go to sea. Check systems. Conduct training launch. March 2, 1968. K-129 leaves Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky and heads into northern waters. Everything is going according to plan. Last communication session, February 24th. Since then, silence. At the base, they initially aren't worried. Communication with submarines is often lost, the ocean is vast, radio signal waves are capricious. But days pass, then weeks. It becomes clear, something has happened. Soon, a secret search operation begins. Hundreds of planes, dozens of ships, thousands of kilometers of routes. And all, in vain. The Soviet Union finds neither debris, nor surfaced remnants, nor a single signal from an emergency buoy. Officially, the submarine is declared missing. Unofficially, gone on an eternal voyage. When the sea takes, it does not return. It does not like to share what it has taken. But thousands of kilometers from Kamchatka, at the U.S. Navy headquarters in Honolulu, hydroacoustic station operators detect a strange signal. At depth, in the northern Pacific Ocean, approximately 1,500 miles from Hawaii, devices pick up an instantaneous impact, then a low-frequency hum, and silence. Date, March 8, 1968. Time, 23:42 GMT. The sound comes from coordinates where, coincidentally, the Soviet submarine K-129 could have been located. Americans know, somewhere in the cold waters lies a lost Soviet ship. But they remain silent. A secret operation begins, codenamed Azorian. Over the next 7 years, the CIA builds a plan that sounds like a plot from a science fiction novel, to raise an entire submarine from a depth of 4 kilometers. 1974. Pacific Ocean. On the surface, a giant ship appears, Glomar Explorer. Officially, a drilling vessel belonging to billionaire Howard Hughes. Unofficially, one of the most expensive secret projects in the history of intelligence. Beneath the Glomar's hull, a mechanical claw, capable of descending to the bottom and grasping the submarine's metal frame. The operation lasts for weeks. The world suspects nothing. In July 1974, the Glomar raises part of the K-129's wreckage. But not everything. The mechanism breaks midway, and most of the hull once again plunges into darkness, to where light does not live. From the raised section, several human remains are found, documents, and fragments of launch silos. Among personal belongings, a simple item, a small copper cross, attached to a string of burnt fabric. At the bottom, where there are neither stars nor sun, this cross shone so brightly that one of the American divers later said, "It was as if it wasn't made of metal, it was made of memory." The Americans buried the bodies according to naval custom. A mourning ceremony took place aboard the Glomar, everything according to regulations, to the anthem of the Soviet Union. A cassette with the recording was later handed over to the Soviet government. Only then did the world hear for the first time, in the cold darkness, enemies can show respect. But the mystery was not revealed. No one ever found out, why did K-129 perish? Was it an accident during torpedo loading? Or a nuclear warhead explosion? Or, as some whispered, did it collide with the American submarine USS Swordfish, which several days after the disappearance entered a Japanese port with a damaged periscope and dents on its hull? Soviet officers looked at these photographs with grim silence. Officially, the USA declared, damage from an iceberg. But there are no icebergs in the northern Pacific Ocean. Strange reports were preserved in closed archives. They describe 2 points, one in the Pacific Ocean, where the Soviet K-129 exploded, and the second, in the Atlantic, where the Scorpion perished 3 months later. The distance between them, half the planet. But the time interval, an almost perfect echo. As if one death resonated in another. If the sea is a living being, maybe it just sighed twice. In the archives, both sides wrote different things. The Soviets claimed, K-129 perished due to a diving accident. The Americans wrote, a missile compartment explosion is possible. But no single version fully explains the acoustic picture. There are only recordings, 6 impacts, equal in interval, like 6 heartbeats, faltering before death. When silence becomes too loud, conjectures begin to sound within it. Today, K-129 lies at a depth of 4,900 meters, approximately 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. The location is not marked on maps. Tourist vessels do not go there. There are not even buoys. Only emptiness and pressure, enough to crush a steel hull, but not the memory of the people inside. Sometimes the ocean exhales gas bubbles. And it seems, as if a quiet moan rises from the depths. Sonars catch surges, and fishermen passing over that spot, say that compasses behave strangely, as if the needle pulls downwards. Could it be a coincidence? Or perhaps, an echo? An echo of those 4 cries that sounded in 1 year, in 4 different seas. Israeli, Dakar. French, Minerve. American, Scorpion. And Soviet, K-129. 4 countries. 4 seas. 4 coffins of steel, that disappeared almost simultaneously. Perhaps it's not a coincidence. Perhaps 1968 was the year when the sea itself decided to remind us that it is the only true lord of the underwater world. Everything that once went underwater stays there forever. But the sea doesn't keep secrets, it just speaks slowly. Sometimes, for decades. Sometimes, for entire lifetimes. 1968, the world lived its own life. On land, people argued, fought, loved, built, dreamed. At sea, they vanished. In 1 year, within just a few months, 4 submarines from 4 countries went into the depths and did not return. The Israeli, Dakar. The French, Minerve. The American, Scorpion. The Soviet, K-129. 4 different flags. 4 different languages. But the same silence into which they plunged. When you look at a map, these dots are just numbers and coordinates. But if you know that beneath each of them is 100 human fates, the map suddenly becomes a prayer. The sea gives no direct answers. It doesn't like haste. Sometimes it seems that it chooses the moment itself, when to reveal the truth, and to whom. The Dakar was found only 30 years later, in 1999, off the coast of Crete. The hull broken, but the emblem of Israel still visible on board. The world saw her through the cameras of deep-sea robots, and as if for a moment heard the voices of those who had been silent for 3 decades. The Minerve lay in the Mediterranean Sea for more than half a century. She was found only in 2019. A small, time-worn boat, still preserved its shape, as if sleeping, not perished. France fell silent that day, and on the shores of Toulon, sailors stood silently, gazing at the sea, where their fathers and brothers lay at the bottom. The Scorpion, American pride, found almost immediately, but no explanations were ever given. Hundreds of pages of reports, thousands of assumptions, and still no answer. Some say, accident. Others, retribution. But even today, decades later, in every U.S. Ocean Command, May 22 begins with a minute of silence. The K-129, a Soviet shadow, still lies in the cold of the Pacific Ocean. The Americans raised only part of the hull. The rest, forever went into eternal darkness. There, at a 4-kilometer depth, the pressure is 400 atmospheres. Metal turns to dust. But not memory. Memory is not sound, not light, and not text. It is what continues to beat beneath the water column, when everything else has already stopped. Historians still argue. Who is to blame? Were these technical failures? Or secret underwater collisions that no one dared to call war? But, maybe, the answer is not in this. Maybe, it's all simpler. Maybe, 1968 became the year when humanity first looked too deeply into the abyss. And the abyss looked back. There's a strange statistic. In that year, over 200 sailors died, and not one of the submarines sent a distress signal. Not a single request for help. As if they were simply erased from the world. As if the ocean closed the door. Scientists, hydroacousticians, engineers, all tried to explain the coincidence. But the deeper they dug, the less they found. Maybe, it's not about mechanics. Maybe, it's about time. Maybe, these ships didn't disappear, they just went there, where for us time no longer flows. On the shores of all 4 countries stand monuments. Marble slabs. On each, names. On each, an empty space, where no one will place a body. And nearby, always the sea. Because sailors have no other burial ground. When you stand on the shore and look into the distance, where the horizon merges with the sky, it seems that beneath the waves, is not just water. There, is an entire history of humanity, told in the language of silence. Maybe, all these boats, are not just ships. Maybe, they, are like 4 lines of one prayer. A prayer for those who live between depth and light. A prayer for courage and madness, for war and peace, for people who went too far. The sea doesn't lie. It just doesn't rush to speak. And when it finally reveals its secrets, we must listen, not with our ears, but with our hearts. Now, decades later, the ocean sometimes returns small things, debris, buttons, scraps of metal, short signals, reflected by sonar. These are not just remnants of ships. These are traces of time. And, perhaps, in every sound, in every sonar click, in every faint rustle of waves lives an echo of those 4 submarines that once departed. In 1968, 4 boats disappeared. But the sea remembered each one. And as long as it lives, their names will not sink.